Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Jank Tank. This is episode number 4. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'm going to be your host today for the Jank Tank. And joining me on the line, we've got two great fellows. They're still recovering from Burning Man. We've got Christopher Sofsky and Teld. How was the trip?
I was able to thumb my nose at several tech billionaires, so that was fun. That's actually why I went. I just wanted to insult some people that I don't like.
So the only Burning Man I had was me running a fever on the couch for 3 days. So
You were the Burning Man. You know, I would come to your house and sit around and watch you burn.
But feeling a little better today. So praise be there.
For reference, nobody here actually went to Burning Man, so sorry to disappoint. We are going to be talking about cantrips today. So the good old draw spells, good old 1 mana cyclers and stuff like that. Part of the reason, something that's prompting this discussion, is the influx of green cantrips, which I know you two are excited to talk about. Prior to maybe a year ago, cantrips are really just a blue discussion, but green is kind of encroaching on that territory, so we've got a little bit to talk about. We're going to talk about what makes a cantrip, what makes the good ones good, and, which ones you should be slotting into cubes, how many you should be slotting into cubes, stuff like that. So, casual little discussion about cantrips. Before we get into this, put you two on the spot. What's your favorite cantrip in the unrestricted cube right now?
I'm sure Teld has an opinion.
Does Invasion of Ixalan count?
We're going to talk about whether that counts or not. It kind of does. I mean, if you broadly say a cantrip is just a card that replaces itself, then sure. We're going to kind of pseudo-define what we're talking about here, and I'm not sure Invasion of Ixalan is actually going to fit into our definition or not, but it's cantrippy, at least.
I would say that my favorite is probably Elven Farsight, not because I think it's necessarily the best, but because there's a lot of hate for the card, and I think it's actively really good.
Yeah, I agree with that as far as the actual cantrips that can't generate card advantage. I think Farsight's my favorite as well. It's a really interesting card, and people aren't playing it for some reason. Card's great.
Look at! I wish you guys could see our faces right now because they just immediately sniped off 2 green cantrips. I mean, do you guys know my answer?
No.
Hard Evidence. I freaking love that card. Hard Evidence is the cantrip that gains you 10 life and makes a crab token.
Yeah, Detective Pinchy is fantastic.
Detective Pinchy. That's the blue make a crab, make a treasure token. It's so good. It's obviously not just the best cantrip. You would rather have a Ponder, Preordain, something like that in a lot of decks that want cantrips, but when you have it in that aggro matchup and your opponent has to use a removal spell to get your crab out of the way, you just feel so good. It also generates 2 tokens. It's the ultimate bargain card.
Speaking of Ponder, I'm pretty annoyed that we don't have it because it's coded on the client.
Yeah. There's an alchemy card, I think, that can create a Ponder or conjure a Ponder. So Ponder exists on the client, but there's no actual Ponder card that we can add to our cube, which is super annoying. Let's go ahead and talk about cantrips here. So, Teld, you're a D&D person. It's my understanding that the word cantrip actually comes from D&D, right? It's basically a spell that doesn't use a spell slot. I don't know enough about D&D to know what that means.
So in D&D, you don't have a mana system, and so instead they use what's called Vancian spellcasting. And to keep it very simple, your spells range in level from 0 to 9th level. And 1 to 9 use spell slots, but 0 level spells in the newest edition of D&D don't. Now they used to, but it's kind of fuzzy there. But cantrips were considered minor magical effects, right? They weren't really spells, so they did very, very limited things. So the idea is a cantrip doesn't do much.
Does the word originate from D&D, or does it mean something that I just don't know? Do you guys know? Is cantrip an actual word that I just don't know?
According to Wikipedia, the word cantrip is of Scots origin, possibly coming from a Gallic term about a chant.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds like what we're talking about today. Well, let's talk about what a cantrip is, what we're talking about for this episode. And we're going to be a little bit loosey-goosey with the term, because when we say cantrip, a lot of times in just colloquial language, we mean a card that replaces itself. But for the purposes of this recording, for this session, I think we're mostly going to be talking about 1 mana spells that just turn into another card, right? So my question for you all, are we discussing, you mentioned Invasion of Ixalan. Just point blank question, is Invasion of Ixalan a cantrip? Or is a 2-mana spell with some selection a cantrip, like Impulse? Do you guys consider those spells cantrips?
So, for me personally, when I think of a cantrip, I think of a card that specifically sees cards and replaces itself, right? Like, that's what the card does, and I generally think of them as being 1-mana spells. But by the same token, I'm sure we've all heard Magic players say, oh, this creature cantrips, like Elvish Visionary cantrips. So I think you can define it in a couple of different ways. When I think of cantrip, I think of like Brainstorm. That's what I would consider a cantrip. But, you know, by the same token, like if a creature quote unquote cantrips and that's the terminology that you use, I think that that's fine.
I think these days we just expect more at 2 mana. It's kind of hard to say most of the 2 mana cards are really cantrips when they almost all generate card advantage these days. The one exception in our cube is going to be like your Impulse variant, so we run Tezzeret's Ambition. And that one even gives you more upside than like a 1-mana spell would, right? Because you get to sit with the cards off in the side pot until you decide to use them. So I think at 2 mana, you really start needing to get some either card advantage or like residual value for you to want to play it. So I don't really know if that counts anymore.
Yeah, I mean, you can, like, call it a cantrip, but we're really talking about 1-mana spells or 1-mana abilities that turn into another card, usually with upside, which we'll talk about. What about Cycling? You guys think Cycling counts? Like, Hieroglyphic Illumination, 4-mana instant, draw 2 cards, but you can cycle it for a blue, draw another card. Do you really discuss those in the cantrip conversation? It feels like they're cantrip adjacent.
I don't really consider them cantrips specifically unless they're in blue, and I don't know why I define them that way. I can't defend it. That's just the way that I tend to think about it. Like, I wouldn't consider, what's the card called, like Street Wraith? I would not consider that a cantrip, but I wouldn't argue with anyone that did.
You guys don't play like Slay the Spire, do you?
I played 200 hours of Slay the Spire in 2020.
Are you familiar with like the memes around the alignment charts around like it's there's like the 9 boxes like an alignment chart, and it's like this is a block card and that's a block card. I can't remember what the words they use are, but I feel like that's the conversation we're having, where it's like, you know, this is like technically a cantrip, but you know, it's like it doesn't meet the perfect pedantic definition of a cantrip, but it does the same thing, right?
Yeah, it's like if you heal yourself, is that a block card? You know, since
right,
you're not taking the damage. We are being pedantic, and it was worth having the conversation just to kind of loosely define what we're talking about. Our conversation is going to be geared towards 1-mana spells that you cast for the most part. I think casting is a big part of cantrips because cantrips are huge to spellcast in decks. That's kind of one of their biggest appeals. So I don't really consider cyclers cantrips because you don't cast them, you don't get your spellslinger payoffs for them. But if you want to throw that in the conversation, like, don't at me on Twitter saying you left this out, because we're being loose with the definition. We just kind of broadly talk about cantrip and stuff like that, why you want to include them in the cube. So the definition, you know, don't get too beat up over it. Speaking of cantrips, there are a lot of them out there. Even on Arena, there's a ton of cantrips, but not all of them are good. So we're going to talk a little bit about the features of a good cantrip. You know, you looked at the episode title, The Anatomy of a Cantrip. Let's talk about what makes the good cantrips good. First and foremost, most good cantrips give you the card right away. One of the biggest appeals of playing a cantrip is that it gives you some sort of selection. It lets you dig towards something. And presumably, if you're digging towards something, you want to be able to cast the thing that you get right away instead of waiting on it. So I think the best cantrips give you your card right away. They give you some sort of selection. Cantripping for the sake of cantripping, not good enough, right? Casting a spell that just turns into a spell and does nothing else is not really where you want to be. You want some sort of selection or some sort of upside attached to that cantrip, right?
Depends on how many treasure cruises you have in your deck.
That's true. Like, you would certainly throw like 10 cantrips in your deck if all of the other cards in your deck cared about just casting spells, but there's a big difference between opt, you know, looking at 2 cards and picking the best one among those, versus like Birthday Escape, which gives you no selection at all. It just turns into another card.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the upsides, right? Like, obviously, if your deck's full of tempt cards, Birthday Escape is awesome because the chapter on the tempt is really good. But yeah, I think in general, outside of like those narrow lanes where you've got something that pays you off for just spinning your wheels, or you've got a specific synergy you're enabling, I think generally you want that card selection. That is the most powerful generic thing that makes cantrips good. That's really what we're after. And in the green ones in particular, that's the reason we're playing them, is they give you so much control over your deck.
Yeah, and the green ones especially, you absolutely want to be able to cast the thing that you find off those cantrips that same turn. So
I think the blue cantrips are much more willing to just allow you to spin your wheels. I think there's a lot more blue cards that pay you off for just doing that, so it's a little more forgivable there.
Yeah, we'll talk about some differences between blue and green cantrips here. Another defining feature of a good cantrip is that it doesn't target. I think if you had the choice between including a cantrip that targets in your cube and a cantrip that doesn't target in your cube, and you want your deck to have access to a cantrip in effect, most of the time you want the one that doesn't target. And there are a couple reasons for that. First off, if the cantrip targets like a creature or something like that, you can't just run it out on an empty board, and you need your cantrips to work whenever you need them to work. And also, it opens up the opportunity for fizzling. Perfect example of this is Timely Interference, which is a blue mana instant. Target creature gets -1/-0. It has some kicker clause on it that's not important. And it cantrips. It draws a card. So it's a 1 mana spell. It's an instant, and it draws a card. It even has like a very minor effect on the board. But if there's no creature on board, you can't cast it. And if there is a creature on board and your opponent's able to blink it or sacrifice it in response, your cantrip fizzles. And you can't afford to have your cantrips fizzle. So you don't really want targeted cantrips unless it's targeting something that is not likely to be interacted with. The bottom line is you don't really want your cantrips to target. So my thought about the 1 mana thing too, I was going to talk about 2 mana cantrips versus 1 mana cantrips. It's kind of a moot conversation there. But Chris, do you remember when we were doing the Peasant Cube early on and we kept trying out cards like Curate and Deliberate and stuff like that? These 2 mana spells that give you like more upside, more selection. They might even let you bin some cards and then they turn into another card. They just never pan out, right? They just end up being noticeably weaker.
Yeah, just to comment on that, what's important about cantrips costing 1 mana is the difference between 1 mana and 2 mana is really huge. So like on turn 4, if I cantrip and I see a 3-drop, I can cast that 3-drop if I want to. With a 2 mana cantrip, I can't do that. And a lot of people tend to think of cantrips as like free cards in your deck, and they're really not, right? The reason that you want them to be so cheap is they really help you filter through your deck and find the cards that matter, and that's why you're playing them. But you don't want to do that at a significant mana/tempo disadvantage, because then you're going to get behind, and finding the cards that your deck wants to play to function, you're going to be a little bit behind the 8 ball in terms of tempo. I don't know if you guys would agree with that. I think Teld commented on this earlier. Unless it provides substantial additional value over a single mana cantrip, like Invasion of Ixalan does, then it's not something I'm particularly interested in. Like, you see Impulse in a lot of cubes, and I'm not saying that Impulse is a terrible card, but we stopped playing it because it just never felt great to cast. 2 mana to go find a card, you know, in your control deck, you'd play it or whatever, but, you know, if you have, like, 8 cantrips in your pile and you're not going to play all of them, like, Impulse is going to be, like, the first one that gets cut over the 1 mana effects, I think.
Yeah. One thing I frequently say is that it doesn't take much for a 1 mana card to be good, and I use that to evaluate 1 mana cards differently than I do other cards. But the inverse of that is also true, right? So like for every mana you spend beyond 1, I expect my card to do a lot more. So when I'm paying 2 mana for what's functionally a 1 mana effect, I'm just never going to be happy to cast it, right? When I'm paying 2 mana, I expect it to do something pretty productive given the state of like what 2 mana cards can do at this point. We've got 2 mana cards that win the game.
There's an expectation with the 2 mana spells, and Impulse doesn't quite meet the bar. And it's not that you said it doesn't feel great to cast Impulse. Impulse is like a fine card in a vacuum, but I'm going to talk here in a moment about cube equity. And the fact of the matter is, in a cube setting, that Impulse has taken the slot of every other card that could be in that slot instead. And if you just have like a cantrip that functionally does something very similar to Impulse, it doesn't make a lot of sense to run Impulse if you have a 1 mana spell that does the same thing. We could go on an entirely different episode about like the power of 1 mana and how much of a difference that is. Like 1 mana is the difference between Lightning Strike and a 3 mana deal 3, which is an unplayable card in our environment, you know? So that kind of logic applies to cantrips. Like Opt for 2 mana, it's not playable, right? Like it's just not playable. Opt for 1 mana, however, is still a very playable card. So that 1 mana does make a huge difference. I do have a kind of philosophical question here for you two. Just in general, maybe not in cube necessarily, but just overarching picture. Is there such thing as a quote-unquote bad cantrip? Like, the floor on a cantrip is that it replaces itself, right? So it's really hard for a cantrip to ever be a dead card in your hand. But would you consider a card that just doesn't do very much but still replaces itself? Would you consider that a bad card, or are all cantrips that just replace themselves like generally okay?
Yeah, so I lean towards all cantrips are okay as long as you keep in mind the context of the format you're playing, right? So the example earlier of timely interference, that card's not a slam dunk in any format beyond DMU draft, but like in DMU draft, it's a cantrip and it's totally playable. I've played, 2 or 3 copies of them in my decks and it was fine. It's not an all-star, but it's good. And then like another card we had listed was Abundant Growth, right? The 1 mana green enchantment that draws a card and turns your land into a prismatic land. And, it doesn't see a lot of play in the most powerful formats, though. Like, it does see fringe play in modern Legacy Enchantress style decks, but it also sees play in Pauper in a couple of decks. So, I mean, it depends on, like, the best cantrips are obviously going to see play in the most powerful formats, but, as you scale back your cantrip's power level, you also have to consider that they're seeing play in weaker formats, because Magic is a rule system that encompasses a bunch of different formats.
Chris, what are your takes? Do you think do you think you can define a cantrip as bad?
Yeah, so Birthday Escape would be an example for me. It's not bad in its own format because it tempts, right?
Yeah, it's actually really good in that format.
Chris just rolled his eyes while saying tempts out loud.
Yeah, again, not tempted by tempt. But, so that's an example of a cantrip that provides additional value in its own format, but for the context of Cube, it basically just draws a card. And it's one of the reasons that I don't consider things that cycle for 1 mana to be particularly good cantrips. Now the fact that they cycle means that they're also cards, right? And that's why they're good. But a card that literally just draws a card, the only spot where I could imagine that being particularly acceptable for a powerful cube would be in an Is It deck that really doesn't care how good the cantrips are. It just wants as many as possible to trigger its payoffs. But we're not playing Birthday Escape because it just doesn't do enough. I want my cantrip to at least see 2 cards.
Do you remember, Teld mentioned Abundant Growth. One of the biggest debates we ever had in our group was about Abundant Growth. Do you remember the conversation that we had with a lot of people, and people were saying that if Abundant Growth was legal on Arena, it should absolutely be making unrestricted cubes and stuff like that? And the basis for that being not that it fixed your mana or anything, but just that it cantripped and there was virtually no opportunity cost for playing it. I don't know if you remember that conversation, but it was a pretty heated debate between people about whether or not that's worth a cube slot or not. My take is that if I were drafting a cube and I saw Abundant Growth, it would probably make a deck, right? It might not do anything. It's probably not going to fix your colors that often. If you have Blink's energies, sure, there's probably a reason for it to be there. But in our unrestricted cube, if you saw Abundant Growth, it would probably make your deck and it'd be fine. But my question would be, what is the card that you're cutting to make room for Abundant Growth? It's a lot different when you're talking about cube space, and I want to talk real quickly about cube equity, the idea that every card you add to a cube is taking the space of whatever else you would put there if that card wasn't there. So yes, Abundant Growth would make decks, but is it the right card for the slot? Should you be playing a different card instead? And that's a pretty big conversation when you're talking about cantrips, because there are blue spellcaster decks out there that would probably play 12, 13, 14 cantrips, right? If you had the spell payoffs, you would just put every cantrip you could in your deck, but are you supposed to put 12, 13, 14 cantrips in your cube? And my answer is probably no, right? Because of cube equity, those cantrips are taking the slots of other cards. Every cantrip that you add to your cube is replacing the other 10,000 cards that could be in that spot. So how many cantrips are you supposed to put in a cube? Is it possible to go overboard on cantrips? I mentioned this partly because Theo's why wouldn't we just play 12 cantrips? Obviously, he's I played a cube that had 20 cantrips and I had 14 in a deck and I 3-0'd and my deck was amazing. And it's yeah, you can do that, but should you do that? Even if you can conceptualize decks that would play every single cantrip you could, is there an upper limit to how many cantrips should be taking cube slots?
My perspective is this. We'll talk about it probably on a future episode. We did a Build-A-Cube series for the previous iteration of the podcast, and we talked about something we called the density exercise in terms of how you build your sections, which, just real quick, is basically an exercise that you do when you're building a cube, and you ask yourself the question, like, how many white 1-drops do I want my mono white aggro deck to have to consider it like the nuts? And, obviously if the answer is like 6, you don't want to put less than 6 1-drops in your white section, because you want the number of cards that a person would want to see to consider themselves getting the best variant of the deck. I think for blue, I think that cantrips are probably the best cards in blue, depending on how you define best cards. So my perspective would be play as many cantrips as you can, while respecting the density of other effects that you want to play. Does that make sense? I don't know what number that is off the top of my head. In our own cube, I would say it's probably something like 7 or 8. But that's just off the cuff. Like, I haven't really looked through and determined, like, how many effects would we cut for more cantrips, but I think at least 2.
Would you agree that overloaded on cantrips makes for repetitive gameplay? Or is that just kind of, like, theoretical?
Oh, absolutely. It used to be the Delver decks. I don't know if you've ever heard them called this. They used to call it like a Xerox deck, where you would play 12 or 16 cantrips, and your game would just be the same thing every single game, right? Your deck would do the same thing. You were just finding your 4 Delvers, your 4 Lightning Bolts, your 4 Stifles or whatever. And you were essentially just playing like 20 cards that helped you find those. I think a good example of this is, I actually have 2 examples involving another card game called Yu-Gi-Oh! If you're familiar with it, it was a really popular anime. I don't know if it still is, but it's kind of a joke that the protagonists have like these terrible decks, but basically they have an emblem. Essentially, the joke is they have an emblem that gives them demonic tutor at the beginning of every turn, right? So like they have these terrible decks, but they get to draw exactly whatever the perfect card is for that scenario. The more, like, I guess, actual factual example to Yu-Gi-Oh! Is modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Consists of essentially like solitaire tutoring your entire deck over the course of like 10 minutes. I don't really play it anymore. Yeah. But my understanding of it is essentially every card tutors for another card. And it leads to these very hyper consistent turns if you're really good with your decks, because your deck is just sort of deterministic at what it's going to do. And that, to me, that sounds really boring, because I think variance is one of the biggest reasons we play card games. It's part of why people hated Companion so much when it first came out, right? Is that when you had a Companion, your deck was going to be doing the same thing on turn, whenever you could catch a Companion every time.
Yeah, stay tuned for episode 5 of the Jank Tank, where we'll be talking about pendulum summons and exceed summons in Yu-Gi-Oh! That'll be our deep dive on the extra deck for Yu-Gi-Oh! So it really comes down to what the cube designer wants, right? If the cube designer wants their Is It deck to look like the same deck every single time, and their solution to that is to put 12 or 13 cantrips in so that the deck is very consistent and always finds the same cards, that's probably fine for the cube designer to do if that's what they want, right? But like you said, if you value the experience of like varied gameplay, and that's why you're playing a singleton curated format, you probably don't want 12 cantrips. You don't want the decks to play out exactly the same from deck to deck between the same archetype. I imagine, I think that leads to a more varied gameplay, more repetitive gameplay, repeatable gameplay, rather than the repetitive experience where you're just looking for the same cards every single time.
Now, some measure of variance reduction is good, right? Because it allows you to express skill, and it allows you to, have more engaging gameplay, right? Because you're invested in trying to, to figure out whatever you need to do with your cantrips. It's just when you hit a certain break point, the decks start essentially just Xeroxing. They start playing the exact same from game to game, and that is not particularly interesting for anyone involved.
Yeah, Chris, do you think it matters? Do you think, from a cube design perspective, like it's okay if a certain archetype is essentially built in such a way that it has the same exact cards every single game, like that's what it wants to do?
That is a complex question. I will say that having your deck do the same thing really, really consistently, I think... Well, I can see Teld's point that like variance helps express skill in a more consistent way, because you have to adapt to different situations. But I would also say that if you have 2 decks that do the same thing every time playing each other, then the better player is going to win the vast majority of those games. So whether or not you consider that a good thing, I think factors into the discussion as well. Like, how much room for a player who might not be as skilled as their opponent but comes out on the better side of variance to win games as a design goal, is that something that you're interested in or not?
And that's an interesting take too, because constructed, if you think about Legacy, maybe even Vintage, I don't know too much about Vintage, but like the cantrip heavy decks are built in such a way that they do exactly that. So I guess if you have like the 8 cantrip deck versus the 8 cantrip deck, you know, theoretically the better player should be winning more often. I don't know.
Or the player goes first.
Out and constructed. Yeah, or you win the die roll. Let's go ahead and talk about the individual colors here. Blue's pretty easy to talk about. I think most people know these cantrips or know what they do, but I did kind of want to get like a rough power ranking from you guys here and follow up on something that came up in a recent episode. We have in our unrestricted cube Brainstorm, Consider, Sleight of Hand, Opt, and Hard Evidence. And then there are a couple others like Birthdayscape, Timely Interference. There's an Alchemy one that doesn't do anything. That's just a cantrip for cantripping. We don't play those. So we have the 5 blue cantrips. I'm curious how you guys would roughly rank these. And specifically, in one of the previous episodes, you guys, or I think Chris had said that he prefers Consider to Brainstorm and Tell. You said you were going to push back on that, but it wasn't the right episode to do that. I was wondering if you guys could flesh that out a little bit more. So Brainstorm, Consider, Sleight of Hand, Opt, Hard Evidence. Like, what are the best ones in the card pool? Which ones would we cut if we got to cut them? How do you feel about these cantrips?
So I personally like Consider better than Brainstorm. You see one less card, but it gives you the ability to filter through something that you don't want to draw. Now, I do think that the whole like Brainstorm is not good without fetches thing I've heard proliferate in the cube community. I think that Brainstorm gets a lot better with fetches, but like I think people evaluate Brainstorm like you almost always see 3 cards that you don't want to draw, and then they call it Brainstorm locked, which I don't even know what that's supposed to mean because you were going to draw those cards anyway. But yeah, I think Brainstorm is a fine cantrip. I think it's more of a feel thing. I don't know if I could commit to the position that I think that Consider is more powerful than Brainstorm. Brainstorm is more likely to find what you need right now. But I also think that Consider continues to grow in power as you get more things that actually care about the graveyard. Now, we don't have like the dig through times and the Murktide regions of the world, so it is possible that Brainstorm is better than Consider without the graveyard synergies, but I think in the broader context of Magic, I think Consider is a better cantrip.
I think Brainstorm is the best cantrip in the cube, even without fetches or anything else. The reason being is getting to look at that third card. The blue decks right now are in a position where it is so much more important to have the right card right now than it is to worry about a turn or 2 from now. Like, you're just put in a position so frequently where having the right card at this moment will keep you alive in a game that you would otherwise die. Brainstorm is the only cantrip we have right now that lets you look at 3 cards. There's also some synergies you can pick up around shuffling your deck and all that, but like even beyond any of that, just looking at a third card is exceptionally powerful. I think the second best one's probably Hard Evidence, though. I think Tim was onto something when he was talking about it gaining you 10 life.
I wasn't exaggerating.
Our cube is exceptionally proactive, and sure, Hard Evidence is the worst cantrip if you're just looking to draw cards. And I know that goes exactly opposite of what I just said about finding the right card right now. But the thing is, Hard Evidence gives you the time to actually leverage that resource, and it ends up working almost like kind of like a 2-for-1, right? It ends up being a 1-mana 2-for-1. Mostly just gains you a bunch of life in a cube where life matters.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Sleight of Hand and Opt are, like, not bottom of the barrel. They're still good. You're happy to play them, but they're worse than the other ones. I pick Brainstorm and Consider kind of at the same rate. If I have any combo with Brainstorm, like a Kefnet or a Fabled Passage, then I will probably prioritize it. And if I have anything that cares about the graveyard, I'll probably go for Consider instead. It's really contextual. If I'm light on removal, I might take Hard Evidence.
So I guess it'd be fair to say that we all agree that Brainstorm, Consider, and Hard Evidence are the 3 best ones, right? We just don't necessarily agree which order they go in.
Yeah, and that's our cube specifically, not all time. We'll talk about some of the ones we don't have access to, but that's blue cantrips. They're all kind of, to some degree, interchangeable, and we are still in the market for a few more, but we wouldn't play 12 of these effects if we had them. We'd probably play 7 to 8. But we do get to talk about the green cantrips here, and I'm going to go ahead and toss the reins over to you guys a little bit here. The green cantrips, just to kind of set the stage, this is not something that green has traditionally gotten. We've had Adventurous Impulse. There might be other ones like Commune with Nature, which I think was just recently reprinted as a very old card. Commune with Dinosaurs, stuff like that. These really kind of janky ones, but we've actually gotten some really good green cantrips lately. And I wanted you guys to talk about basically what you've talked about with me off air about why you like the green cantrips so much, what they're adding to the cube, and which ones are your favorites.
So the green cantrip conversation for us kind of began with Seed of Hope. So I can't remember what set that was. It looks like it was Mom. We completely skipped over it. And then I did some like hypergeometric math, or I should say the internet did some hypergeometric distribution math for me. This was during a period where green was like routinely 3-0ing like every single week. And the average green deck had something like 20 permanents in it, or once you counted lands, like 36 permanents in it. So you were basically in the high 80s, low 90s or something like that to see 2 permanent cards that you could choose from, and you were basically guaranteed to hit something.
Yeah, it's somewhere north of 95% on your average green deck.
Yeah, I'm just going to, maybe we need to get into this a little bit later, but I'm just going to go ahead and say it now. I personally think that green is the color after blue that most benefits from cheap card selection. And the reason is green decks run in, or specifically the really rampy decks, like the stompy decks, tend to play a little bit more like bigger red decks where like you're just, most of your cards are threats. So you don't really need as much card selection because you're just going to keep drawing threats. If you're playing a hard ramp deck, you're finding a balance between the number of accelerants you need to play and the number of payoffs that you need to play. And it is entirely possible in those ramp decks, because it's kind of like an A plus B synergy deck. It's very possible for your opening hand to have like nothing but payoffs or nothing but accelerants. And that's a hand that you basically have to mulligan every time. And I've play tested green decks that have, like 5 cantrips in them. And it just makes it so much more likely that you're going to be able to keep your opening hand, because the accelerants are going to pump out a bunch of mana if you just draw all accelerants and a cantrip or 2. And then you can cantrip into the payoffs. Or this would be a sketchier keep, in my opinion, but if you have an opening hand without like a good accelerant in it, but let's say you have like a 3-drop, a 4-drop, and another 4-drop, and like a couple lands and a cantrip, I'm a lot more comfortable keeping that than if my hand was all 3 and 4 drops. That's not a hand I would keep. So the reason, just to reiterate, like the reason that cantrips are so powerful in blue is A, there's spells payoffs. That needs to be considered, no pun intended. But it's also the fact that blue decks have a variety of different cards, and Teld alluded to this earlier, and you need to draw the right ones for your deck to function, which is why it's so important. Green decks, in my opinion, are basically exactly the same. You have to draw the right cards. And when your late game is like the best late game in the entire cube environment, being able to consistently see your accelerants and your late game in a timely fashion is really, really powerful, which is why I'm so high on the green cantrips.
Yeah, the green cantrips create this weird spot with green where now you're more consistently finding dorks. So if your opponent's interacting with your dorks, you're finding more of those. If you're missing lands, you're finding those. And then once you hit a certain point in the game, they guarantee you a chain of threats. I think one that's really impressed has been, we talked about it earlier, but Elven Farsight, the Scry 3 on that card alone is almost worth a card. It's close to it. There's always, people don't really play this card for some reason. I think my understanding of it is that you can technically whiff on the card, or it can lead to some awkward draws with it. But one, I have never found that to be the case. I've whiffed on it maybe once the entire time we've had it, and most of the time it finds you something in the Scry 3 plus a land so that you can set up your next land drop. But just these green cantrips kind of started really taking off with Abundant Harvest and Once Upon a Time, and we just got a bunch of good ones now. Like I said, we don't really consider Invasion of Ixalan necessarily because it's a 2-for-1, but like that one's just insane. It's a 4/3 that impulse draws you a card. These cards just really improve the consistency of your deck. And Tim pushed back on us and said, at one point was like, how many of these are too many? How many would you play before your deck starts having consistency issues? And so we decided to test it, and 5 is still good. That's where we're at right now is like you can put 5 in a green deck, in like a mono green deck. Not completely min-max. We built a green deck was like 3 or 4 of the dorks at 1 mana. And we cut out a couple of the best cards, to assume that somebody else was drafting it, right? But you ended up with a mono green deck, and I tested like 4 different decks against it, and it was just hyper consistent. It was blowing me out because it was just so smoothly. able to transition to whatever you're doing. If you're interacting with their dorks, it finds more dorks. If you're interacting with their threats via discard, it finds more threats. You couldn't really, it became much more difficult to stop the deck because they had so much consistency from those cantrips. And I think blue cantrips are more important in the context of what they do, but I actually think the green ones are just more powerful because green is so good.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts on this. Blue cantrips are super important for blue because blue usually needs to find a specific kind of card. It's usually there for a control deck. You need to find your Wrath or a counter spell or a finisher or something like that. Green cantrips are usually setting up to find a finisher. Like you use it in the early game to find mana, or you use it in the late game to find something to play, a finisher. And for green, it almost doesn't even matter what you find. You're not usually looking for a specific creature. You're just looking for something to do. It doesn't, like, if you're cantripping towards Titan of Industry or Tovolar's Huntmaster, you'll take whichever one you get and be happy with it. Whereas blue, like, you need a hyper-specific card. So the green cantrips make your deck more consistent, even if you're not looking for a very hyper-specific card. My pushback, which... using pushback lightly, I like these cards. I think they're fine. The two reasons I push back a little bit is if you have like 8 blue cantrips in your cube, no big deal, right? You can cast a cantrip, find another cantrip. You can keep, chaining them into one another. The green cantrips are a little more awkward because if you have 8 Seed of Hopes in your deck, you actually do increase your whiff rate by a decent amount. Mm-hmm. That's where things like Invasion of Ixalan are great because it is a permanent, right? It's a cantrip that plays into what all the other cantrips need, so you're not diluting your deck. Elven Farsight and Seed of Hope should never miss. Like, theoretically, yes, there's like a 5% chance that these cards can miss, but you should not be putting them in decks where they really can miss. So I don't really buy the pushback that these cards can miss, therefore you shouldn't be playing them or you shouldn't be using a cube slot. I think that's a moot point. The reason I don't take Elven Farsight very highly or Seed of Hope very highly is that if I feel like I can construct a green deck that's already consistent without them, or I just have like a ton of card draw because green just gets to do that for whatever reason, then I don't feel like I necessarily need the cards, and I'm willing to take a different draft pick over them. But if I feel like my deck is missing raw card advantage or just needs the consistency, or maybe I'm that like exact 50-50 split of ramp creatures and ramp payoffs with nothing in between, and I just need to make sure that I can find the right half of my deck at the right moment, then I'll take the cards a little bit more highly. You don't need that consistency every single game if you're constructing a deck that's already consistent. But if you're that like split where you have the chance of just drawing the wrong half of your deck, these cards basically tie the whole room together.
Yeah, so I don't think that in your like Gruul Stompy deck you're supposed to play Seed of Hope. I think you're supposed to play like another 2-drop. Yeah. Right? Or you're supposed to play like another 4-drop. That's not where they belong. Where I think they belong, and one of the reasons I'm so excited about them is basically, and this has also been improved by the number of 1-mana accelerants, but it used to be that our quote-unquote ramp deck was just a mid-range deck that just went a little bit bigger, right? So you played like plenty of bridge cards. You were probably playing like 4 or 5 4-drops. You know what I mean? Like 3 5-drops, a couple 6-drops, and like a 7-drop, and then like a lot of dorks. And when I was building the playtest deck, I was like, okay, I put a bunch of green cards in there and a bunch of cantrips, and I was like, shit, what do I cut? And what I ended up cutting, because I had a lot of dorks, was I ended up just really cutting down on my 2-drops and really cutting down on my 4-drops, keeping a good number of 3-drops because 1-mana accelerant into 3-drop like Augur or Courser that then like gives you even more card advantage as like a really, really powerful start to a game. But like I ran 1 4-drop and it was Questing Beast. I ran like 2 5-drops, and then I just stuffed like 6 and 7-drops into my deck, and everything else was dorks and cantrips. And that's where these cards belong. They don't go into every green deck. I think that they are the cards in our cube, at least, that differentiate a true ramp deck from a mid-range deck. Because that consistency thing you were talking about, Tim, if you're playing like, what do they call it, British Racing Green, I can't remember who coined that term, but British Racing Green was basically like a green mid-range deck with a lot of proactive threats. It's basically like an aggro deck that just plays a turn slower and has a more powerful late game.
Also known as Unga Bunga.
Unga Bunga Green. Yeah, that deck is very consistent because you're just drawing cards like Quirion Beastcaller and Questing Beast and Tireless Tracker every turn. Like, you're just supposed to play more threats instead of cantrips. But if I'm trying to skip the mid game, that's where I really want my cantrips. Because if you're trying to skip the mid game and then you don't draw a way to skip the mid game, you're kind of screwed. Like you said, it depends on the consistency of the deck. I think that a pure ramp deck is just less consistent than a mid-range deck, and that's where you want the cantrips to make up that consistency difference.
Yeah, I think the big deal is these cantrips are pushing the power level on an archetype that was inconsistent but extremely potent, right? Like your Titan of Industry decks are those are the decks when we talk about green having the best in game. That's the deck we're talking about. We're not talking about the Gruul Unga Bunga deck that are trying to like actually just kill you off of. They're trying to play Bloated Contaminator on turn 2 and run you over. The green decks that are playing like Titan of Industry are the ones that are just slamming haymakers. The Radagast decks that's like your 4-drop, right? You're just playing a bridge. That's your bridge card. Is it draws you cards? These decks though are pretty inconsistent if you aren't playing these cantrips, and these cantrips tie that together and let you leverage the insane power of the late game of these decks. And so I think that's why they perform so well. I think you're okay playing like 1 to 2 of these cantrips in Gruul, particularly like Elvish Farsight probably going to hit most of the time, right? And it's cheap. Invasion of Ixalan is awesome in Gruul because you can leverage that one. You can take that one turn off of attacking your opponent's face to get a 4/3, which is really good. Probably the best deck at leveraging that, actually. And then obviously Abundant Harvest goes in any green deck. I will say I do think Seed of Hope is very much in that category of like you only really want that in the ramp deck. So like that's probably the weakest one, but it's still good.
I'm interested to see if we keep getting these or not. They're kind of new. Once Upon a Time and Abundant Harvest aren't new, but it feels like the last couple sets we've gotten a green cantrip or two. So I'm curious to see like if they keep pushing these effects and what we get down the line.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know how many we would cap out at playing necessarily. Probably a smaller number than in blue, almost certainly a smaller number than in blue. But if we keep getting more options, then theoretically they're going to get better. Seed of Hope is like it's good, but like I think we could eventually see a Seed of Hope style card that has just like a little bit more oomph on it.
I could see us going up maybe one more, but I think 5 to 6 is probably about the most you want, because like we mentioned, if you're playing a more proactive green deck, you don't want too many of these. You want like 1 or 2 of them. So, you don't want to have, it's not like every blue deck will play like 3 to 4 cantrips minimum,
Yeah. There's also Wilds of Eldraine had that Feral Encounter card, which it's not really in the cantrip conversation because it only draws into a creature when you're on like 5 or 6 mana. But that was a spell that let you dig in green for a creature and exile it and cast it till end of turn, which is not really something that like green has done before. That card, I don't think so. That might be another indication that we're just getting more ways for green to dig towards cards and stuff like that down the line. Which cool card, not really in the conversation here. The Mardu spectrum just kind of grouped together real quick. They don't really get cantripping for the sake of cantrip. And red obviously gets like the card selection, but it usually nets even or goes down on cards with things like Faithless Luden and Tormented Voice. And tell you've recognized that modern card design, like it wouldn't be that shocking if we actually just got a 1-mana Tormented Voice at some point. Magmatic Insight.
I feel like they like marginally push Tormenting Voice every single set. Like
they do.
It's like this time we got Tormenting Voice, but you get to put a +1. You get to pump your creature and deal damage. It's like that's a really good Tormenting Voice.
Well, it's kind of like how Black got Altar's Reap, which was 1 in a black, sack a creature, draw 2 cards at instant speed, and it used to get that over and over and over again. Like every set had Altar's Reap, and then one day they're just like Village Rites. We're going to give this effect to you for 1 mana now, and maybe they do that with Tormented Voice. There is a card called Magmatic Insight, which is not on Arena. It's a red sorcery, discard a land, draw 2 cards. So that is Tormented Voice for 1 mana, but you have to discard a specific kind of card. Red has like damage-based cantrips like Light Up the Stage and Needle Drop. White doesn't really get to do the cantripping thing, but it has a lot of creatures that generate, virtual card advantage, stuff like that. And then black does have things like Village Rites. If you talk about 2-mana spells, there's cantrips that fill up the graveyard, like Ransack the Labs and things like that. The Mardu spectrum, since a lot of it is geared towards aggressive decks and aggression and stuff like that, and sacrifice synergies and whatnot, you don't really get a lot of cantrips for the sake of cantripping because you don't really need to. Those decks just kind of want to play out to the board a lot, so not much to talk about in the Mardu spectrum there.
I could see a handful of cantrips in black being pretty decent because sacrifice is like the ramp deck is another A+B deck. I think you're probably seeing a through line here, folks. Like, I think that A+B synergy style decks actually do benefit more from card selection than like a mono red deck where every single draw is like the same card. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to spend tempo digging because like I'd rather just play another cheap creature, which is what I would be digging for anyway. But I doubt that we will see like 1-mana cantrip style cards in black. I guess it's possible.
I actually think that we're somewhat likely to see them because black has the rule of isn't black's color identity is you can do anything as long as you pay life to do it. I think we're due for like 1 black, pay 2 life, preordain or something.
Well, and our rock decks, like our Jund and black-red mid-range decks, would almost certainly play cards like that. So,
I mean, if there was a black hard evidence, you would just put that in every black deck, right? Because it just gives you a body to sacrifice.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you don't really get those, but that does kind of segue a little bit into just a brief section I want to talk about, which is cantrip creatures. And my question to you guys, so when we say cantrip creatures, we basically mean all of those designs that are like, when this creature enters the battlefield, draw a card. And there have been so many of them lately. I think it's a testament to Best of One Magic being super popular on Arena, that they just want these playable cards that keep the gas flowing. But there are so many of these lately. They've become really good, just on-rate creatures that replace themselves. And my question to you guys is, why play cantrips at all when you can just play threats that turn into extra cards? Like, why make the room in your cube for cantrips when you can just play your Cloudkin Seers and your Owlbears and stuff like that, add bodies to the board, and just draw cards that way?
Well, outside of one specific example that's probably the most cubed card of all time, you do pay more mana for your creature. You don't really get a good rate for them, right? So, some of the examples that you have listed were like Inspiring Overseer. I mean, 3 mana for a 2/1 is not exactly a great rate, right? That's it's not the worst deal ever in Limited, but it's not where you want to be. So you are paying extra to get that card draw, whereas your blue cantrip, for example, costing 1 mana is very, very efficient and allows you to play the cards you found the same turn. But these add to your board. So it shouldn't be confusing that modern Magic is so driven by Muldrifters, right? That there's so many good cards that just generate value. I mean, we talk about Mole Slayers all the time, and that's kind of where we're headed now. But they push the creatures with ETB and death triggers, and they push the removal. Then they push the creatures, and they push the removal. It's this arms race that's constantly escalating.
For the listener, I know what it is, but what's the most cubed creature of all time?
If I had to guess, it's Thraben Inspector. It's because it's common, so it's in every Pauper cube, every Peasant cube. It's in the MTGO Vintage cube. I assume it's in most people's Vintage cubes, Legacy cubes, and Modern cubes. Like, I have to assume if you have a cube and like a Thraben Inspector's in it, right?
Yeah. So why does Thraben Inspector, why does Spirited Companion, why do these cards make the cut? Spirited Companion, 2 mana, 1/1, enter the battlefield, draw a card.
Well, in white, the reason that these cards can be good, and I think they're significantly better than they are in like green, is because the bodies are anemic, but white is full of anthems, and +1/+1 counter distribution, or cards that care about how many creatures you have on the battlefield or whatever. So they have additional synergies. Like, if I play Spirited Companion early and draw a card and following up with like a Wedding Announcement into an Angel of Invention, then that body is really significant. I just want the body. White wants bodies, and it can do things with bodies that other colors can't do. And if you go into like black-white, like Thraben Inspector and Spirited Companion come down, let you see another card, and then you can just feed them to like Yawgmoth or Woe Strider or something like that, so they provide additional value. They're generally not as good as cantrips in a lot of situations because you're spending extra mana, and the body that you're getting is often in powerful cubes, especially in powerful cubes where green is playing its best cards and like the creatures that they're playing are just huge. You really don't want to be playing a 2 mana 1/1, like even if it drew you a card. You don't necessarily want to be playing that card in like an aggro deck because you just want to apply as much pressure as you absolutely can as quickly as possible. So what these cards need, and I just pointed to the examples that we have in white, what these cards need is the ability for that small body to actually be used for something relevant to the game.
So I actually wouldn't consider Doggo in the same conversation as Thraben Inspector for exactly that reason. I think you're the dog you're overpaying for. Like, it's fine. It's a good curve filler, but it's closer to like a Revitalize than it is an actual creature. Like,
well, you can blink it too.
Yeah, sure. Thraben Inspector is pretty unique though in that the body isn't premium stats. Like, I guess if you wanted premium, it'd be a 2/1, but like a 1/2 isn't strictly worse than a 2/1. There's a lot of board states where Thraben Inspector attacks into or blocks really well, and so that's why I consider that card a little unique. Is because you delay on the draw card, you're getting a good body for the rate you're paying, and it avoids that problem of being really, really anemic.
Yeah, and obviously playing devil's advocate a little bit there, but I don't think your cantrip creatures, even if they're good rate, are replacements for actual cantrips in a cube. But what are your guys' takes on just cantrip creatures in general? Let's say you're not slotting in Cloudkin Seer over Opt or something like that, but when do you slot in cantrip creatures? Like, it's just when you have synergy with them? Because it's very easy to, go to our peasant cube, copy the list, and sub out a bunch of cards for Owlbear and Moldrifter and Cloudkin Seer and Priest of Forgotten War and stuff like that. Like, is there a limit to how many cantrip creatures you would put in a cube? Because generally they tend to be pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, this is one area where I'm kind of glad where they push threats that are just threats. So, I mean, Defiler of Vigor, for example, is a bit of an egregious card. But I do like that it's a card that only helps you kill your opponent, right? It's really, really good at that. But that's all it does. It doesn't draw you a bunch of extra cards. And we could get an entire issue about the Mole Slayer thing where they're killing you and generating card advantage. But I think it's just the easier design in Modern Magic to have these Moldrifter creatures because they make the removal that they're pushing seem less bad, especially like you said in like the best of one scenario. People hate when their first 4 plays get Doombladed or whatever. It just they feel like that's not a reasonable gameplay. But, I'm a bigger fan of having cards like Baneslayers or Bobs, Dark Confidant style cards that generate card advantage for sitting in play over long periods of time, even if that card advantage is bigger and maybe game winning as opposed to just drawing a card. I think the all Moldrifters on deck gameplay is really, really boring.
It is, and I also, Tim, I think it is a design decision you have to make in terms of gameplay. Now with Pauper, like, the bodies on creatures are just not good for the mana relative to higher rarities. So, these cantripping creatures tend to be the best creatures, right? But in the case of, like, a Cloudkin Seer, like, yeah, it cantrips, it's a 2/1 flyer, that's, like, a fine card for Peasant, but, like, I'm not putting that in my unrestricted cube over, like, a Brazen Borrower or a Chrome Host Seed Shark or a V-Click, because what those cards do is so much more powerful than make a 2/1 draw card. So I think the upper limit is really like dependent on your power level and like how many good ones do you even have. Like once you introduce rares, you see a lot fewer cantripping creatures that just cantrip, right? Like rares tend to do different things and do more. So I don't necessarily think there's an upper limit. It just depends on whether or not you enjoy board stalls, and whether or not the cards are like actually good enough. Because like in our unrestricted cube, if you just played like a white section that was all like cantripping creatures, like the green deck and the red deck are just going to run you over every time because they don't care how many cards are in your hand if your creatures suck and can't block.
Yeah, it goes back to that cube equity thing I was talking about, right? Because if we were invited to play someone else's cube and it was like 95% the same as our unrestricted cube, and you were drafting and you saw Inspire and Overseer, like you might take Inspire and Overseer. It might make your deck. You might have some sort of synergy with it. But I'm sure the question that would come to your mind is, what card isn't here because you made room for Inspire and Overseer, right? And those cantrip creatures all kind of ask that same question, especially when you're talking about rares. Every cantrip creature you put in your cube is presumably taking the spot of something more powerful that could have been in that slot. So,
Yeah, I think even at Peasant, one thing I think's been really great about Fire Design is we're seeing a lot more aggressive designs in lower rarities. So the best game plan is not always just to play mono Durdles, right? Like green deck still, if you're playing just a regular green mid-range deck, you still have your Stealth Packmates and your Owlbears and all that sort of stuff that are really, really good. But in the other colors especially, we're seeing a lot more cards that encourage you to attack and leverage tempo really well, which I think is a nice design change, given how most Peasant cubes were designed for all of eternity.
Yep. Why don't we go ahead and wrap up by just talking about what to look forward to in the future here. I listed off all the blue cantrips that we have access to. We're only playing 5 of them. We have a couple others on the sidelines. We've been asking for more cantrips in the future just so that we can kind of flesh out the number that we want in our cube, and I feel like we're slowly getting them. What's on the wish list here of cantrips that already exist out there? I made a short list. You guys tell me, which ones would you most invite to the platform for the unrestricted cube? We're talking about Ponder, Preordained, Gataxian Probe, Thought Scour, Serum Visions. There's a bunch of others there. And if you guys have any that come to mind for other colors, let me know too. But I think that's mostly a blue conversation because traditionally the cantrips have all been blue. Which ones you guys looking forward to when we get them?
I think you covered the really big ones. I'm interested in Teld's perspective on like what is the top priority. Like if we got to choose one blue cantrip to get in the next anthology, what would it be?
So I think the spike in me wants preordain. I think that's the best one that we don't have. That being said, I really like Serum Visions, and I'm also, I know it's silly, this is really far down the list, it probably wouldn't even make our cube, but I also do love Quicken, the one that makes the next sorcery you cast into an instant. You can like wrath your opponents at instant speed, and that's really adorable. But I think Preordain is probably like the one that we want. But Serum Visions, for whatever reason, I always loved that card. I like the setting up your next draw step kind of cards.
The strictly worst preordain. Yeah. Chris, if you had to pick one, which blue cantrip would you add?
I think I would choose Ponder just because the art is super iconic and I love it, but I wouldn't necessarily make the argument that it's better than Preordain. I think it's pretty clear what the best blue cantrips are, and like between Ponder and Preordain, whichever one you prefer, those are the top priority, 100%. Thought Scour and like Mental Note are cards that I think are good if you have like Murktide Regent in your cube, if you've got the Delve spells in your cube. For us, I think they're pretty close to just 1 mana draw card, which is not a card I would be interested in playing necessarily. The Bun Magic Cube, which is maintained by the fellows over at Lucky Paper Radio, are playing Portent. What do you guys think about that card? Portent is 1 blue sorcery. Look at the top 3 cards of target player's library, so notably you can target your opponent. Then either shuffle that library or put those 3 cards on top of the library in any order. Draw a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep. So you can basically...
You fate seal?
Yeah, you can manipulate your opponent's library and you still get a card at the beginning of the next turn's upkeep, or you can basically bad brainstorm for yourself.
I mean, that's cute. That's probably really annoying.
That's fair. It could be annoying.
Yeah, if an anthology came out tomorrow and it had that card in it, I think we would play it. But I think once we hit density of cantrips, it would probably be one of the first cuts. You can mess around with your own library. You can mess around with your opponent's library. It's fine. I mean, it's exactly what we want in a cantrip, right? It draws a card and then it has a little bit of extra selection on top of it. So I don't see it being that bad, even though it could be annoying. But you're going to use this on yourself more often than not.
Yeah, the only one that on this list that I kind of really hope we don't get anytime soon is Probe. Yeah, I don't like that card. I don't like it for multiple reasons, like being a colorless card that gives perfect information. I don't think that's particularly fun or engaging gameplay. I think, first of all, I like mana, like cards having to cost a specific color of mana unless they're explicitly colorless cards. And then I kind of like the hand information aspect of Magic being more restrictive to a few specific blue cards or black.
Of all Magic cards, every Magic card that exists, Probe has the biggest delta between how I feel when I cast it and how it feels when it gets cast against me.
Yep.
Because you guys know how I feel about getting Thoughtseized. When people know my hand, I feel like I don't want to play the game. Like, once all of when my opponent gets to make decisions based on perfect information, I don't want to play the game anymore unless that's like equal to the opponent. So I hate getting Thoughtseized. And the fact that Probe is just like, I now have perfect information at virtually no cost, and it didn't, it replaced itself, just makes me feel miserable. And I love casting Gitaxian Probe, man. It feels so good to cast a Gitaxian Probe because you just get the perfect information at like no cost. I hate the card, like the fact that the card exists, but it would be really powerful. Legitimate question. We get Probe tomorrow. We put it in the cube?
I would. It sounds like Teld wouldn't.
No, we would. We would. Look, me hating the card is not saying that we're not gonna look a gift horse in the mouth here. It's if we got the card, we'd play it. We're still lower on cantrip density than we want, and it's an exceptionally powerful card. It's just one that I would push to remove as soon as we had reasonable alternatives.
I would put it in the cube and just concede more often.
You know what's a cantrip that we didn't actually talk about that is something that I think would be interesting is Manamorphose. What do you guys think about that for our environment? Like, does it do enough as just a free cantrip?
Yeah, Manamorphose, for people playing Arena exclusively, might not know what that is. That's 1 and a hybrid green-red mana, so 2 mana total for an instant, and it lets you add 2 mana in any combination of colors, and then it draws a card. So it's 2 mana to basically turn that 2 mana into 2 other mana, and then it replaces itself. You need a reason, like you need something to do, right? If you care about casting spells, you care about storm count, maybe your 5-color deck would do something with it. I'm curious. I'm struggling to think of decks that would actively put it in there. This is the cube equity question, right? Like this would be replacing something.
Yeah, without like a dedicated storm or spellslinger deck, like you'd have to put, what's the Anivia looking card? The one that's like if you cast a spell, it costs 2 mana instead of 5. It's like a 5 mana 3/3 with prowess, scries 2 when it ETBs, and if you've cast a spell, it costs blue 2 less.
Oh, Stormwing entity.
Yeah, you'd need cards like that, or I guess this is like a silly Clarion Spirit enabler if you want to do that. But I don't know, Manamorphose really needs like something dedicated, busted to do with it. I think if you're just using it as like a filler cantrip spell, I don't think you're getting all that much equity out of it.
That's fair. I like it for Izzet, and I'm also thinking, like, because we were talking about green cantrips, like, if I put this in my mono green deck and it just lets me cut one more card, like my least powerful card, because this literally just cycles for 0 mana, like, is that a card I would put in my deck? I'm not sure.
Maybe.
I'm not sure. I feel like you need something synergistic to do with it. Again, if you have delve spells, like it's kind of it's fine to throw this in an Izzet deck. Just depends on what it would be replacing. The only other cantrip that I dug up outside of blue was Ancient Stirrings, which I don't think would go in our cube. It's 1 green mana sorcery. Look at the top 5, get a colorless card. I think it's just colorless card, actually. Put it in your hand because lands are colorless. I think this would be cool for the card pool because it might tie together more of that like artifact synergy stuff. I have an artifact cube, so I get excited about stuff like that. But green didn't really have much to choose from historically that I found. I almost put Sylvan Library on this list, but that's just turbo card draw. Like that's not even a cantrip at that point.
I think these days it's probably closer to a cantrip than not in our environment, right? Like, how many? Honest question: how many times are you willing to pay 4 life to draw a card in our cube?
Did I get probed or not?
As far as green cantrips are concerned, like, I know we were talking about it as like not being good enough earlier, but like, how far off is Adventurous Impulse? Like, seeing 3 cards for 1 mana in your 90% lands and creatures deck, like, how close is it?
Probably like 1 off. Like if it looked at 4 cards, it would be awesome.
Yeah, I could see that.
So Commune with Nature, is that the one that was just reprinted?
Yes, it looks at 5.
Commune with something.
Yeah, it looks at 5, but it only hits creatures.
Yeah, I don't know if you were being sarcastic or not, Tel, but you were like, oh, this seems like it might be cool and unrestricted. I don't know if you were like just yanking my chain or not.
It was more like I was thinking like, it looks at 5 cards, which is, it looks at 1 more than you can look at with Elvish Farsight. I quickly came around to Scry 3 is really good, but it was more just like a thinking out loud kind of moment.
Yeah, these do need to hit land or creature, I think. And Adventurous Impulse fits that bill. Commune only hits creatures. It can't find the land.
Yeah.
But I think the key with the green cantrips is they need to be able to find a land and they need to be able to find a creature.
Yeah, I mean, Farsight doesn't fit that bill, right? Because it can only draw you creatures, but I think that it is strongly mitigated by the fact that you just get to set up the top of your deck.
Yeah.
Like, if you look at the top of your deck and it's like Nissa, like 3rd, and then 2 lands on top of it, like, you can just set yourself up to, even if you didn't draw a card, you set yourself up to draw Nissa next turn, and like later in the game, like if, let's say I whiff and I see like 3 consecutive lands, which that's not very high likelihood, but later in the game if I see 3 consecutive lands, I personally, and I don't know if you guys would agree with this statement, but I personally think if I'm on like 7 mana already, I think that binning 3 lands or putting 3 lands in the bottom of the library is like roughly equivalent to like drawing 3 cards. Like, is it not? Or drawing 2, I guess, because you're going down a card in your hand. Like, I think it's pretty close to draw 2 at that point.
Yeah, I think that's where like the Scry 3 is just a lot of Scry, and like while it doesn't technically fit the bill, I also like the number of times you get to draw a card with Farsight and then also set up your land drop for the next turn is pretty high, right? Like if you've got 3 cards sitting on top that aren't lands and one of them's a creature, you just set that one on top, bend the other 2, and you've still, like in that case, if you need a land, if that's all you want to draw, it's still kind of in that like I drew a bunch of cards because I didn't hit these cards I can't cast, right?
Yeah, something we could have talked about here that we really didn't is like things that scry, things that dig and stuff like that, or set up the library. Like Chris just alluded to, we could have talked about like how much of a card is Scry 2 worth, how much of a card is Scry 3 worth. I always find those conversations just a tiny bit nebulous because they only apply during the situations in which you're actually casting the card in the game. Like, you can't evaluate the card as a cube slot thinking like, oh, is my Elven Farsight going to be a draw 2? You know, stuff like that. So it's just not applicable from like a card design perspective or a cube design perspective. It's only applicable in the moment when you're casting the card. But yeah, it does feel like that. Like sometimes your Elven Farsight will be a virtual draw 3, not an obvious draw 3, but a virtual draw 3 because you bin 3 cards that were useless and stuff like that. So there's a conversation to be had there about, you know, how much of a fraction of a card is each of these like selection tools worth. But I don't know. It gets pretty dicey. We're already being dicey about the definition of a cantrip, so I don't know if we want to be dicey about how much of a card Scry 2 is worth. It's like 67% or something.
And then how does Scry 2 compare to Surveil 2? You know, you got to get real into the weeds.
Sure, yeah, and if you bargain away a food token while you're scrying, like how much is that worth? Whatever. Anyway, any final thoughts on cantrips here, y'all?
Yeah, I would like to see. I know we said that Mardu colors don't really get cantrips, but you know, it might be nice to see like a cantrip of, you know, those different colors. I'm really pulling for the 1 mana tormented voice. I'm just saying.
Look, if Village Rites, like Torment and Voice and Altar's Reap are so close in my mind as like these filler cards in Limited that you never wanted to play, and Altar's Reap got the bump up. So I'm curious if Torment and Voice ever gets the bump up. It might.
I think in 1 mana we'd play it, right? Like 1 mana Tormenting Voice we'd play.
That'd be excellent. Discard a card, draw 2 cards for red.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like, I think if we got it, I might advocate for testing it. What was that card you were talking about earlier where you like bin a land and draw 2 cards?
Magmatic Insight, I believe.
For 1 mana, I mean, in my red deck, I think I'd do that. I play a Crooks of Brawl deck in Historic, which is like not a great deck. I don't think you should play it. It's kind of
not quite the Adeline Brawl deck, huh?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, it exists in this awkward space where it manages the aggro decks really well, but it just straight up loses to the inevitability decks because you can't disrupt them adequately because the, you know, commander's not in the hand. So, like, it just kind of loses to, like, Atali and Atraxa and stuff, and those are really, really popular. But anyway, where I was going with this is the more of those spells that you have, the more likely it is that you're going to have more than one in your hand, and you can just discard one to the other, if that makes any sense. And, like, the graveyard value is good, but also where I was really going with this, with the Magmatic Insight, is it's pretty common if you discard a land to see 2 more cards that you're just going to draw into another land, right? Sometimes you don't, but in a lot of cases, like, binning the land ends up not really mattering that much because you just draw into an additional land. So I think Magmatic Insight is something that I would want to look at if we had it.
Yeah, I think it's from Magic Origins, too, which could easily slot its way into like a random anthology or something like that. There was a lot of hype about that card when it came out. I don't know if you guys know Raptor. He was big on Channel Fireball for a while. He was like the biggest proponent of this card, and it ended up being kind of a dud for Constructed, but he just like kept jamming it in decks and stuff like that. But I also think we would play it. I mean, it's not Torment and Voice for red, but it's as close as we've got right now. We might get that in the future. Who knows? All right, so with that, let's go ahead and wrap things up. Thanks, as always, to everyone listening. Remember, the best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank is to join our Discord server. Come draft with us, give us your feedback. It's a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals, talk about Cube, Retail Limited. Wilds of Eldraine has been fantastic so far. There's a lot of people posting trophy lists and talking about that. Come hang out, talk about it with us.
Draft Red.
We draft... Draft Red. Stay tuned for the Yu-Gi-Oh! Podcast next week when we talk about Draft in Red in Wilds of Eldraine. We do draft our unrestricted cube, the more powerful of our cubes, on Sundays at 7:30 Eastern, and we fired off our Peasant Cube last Wednesday at 7:30 Eastern. That's had a little bit of an overhaul as well, and a lot of cool new stuff from Wilds of Eldraine.
Yeah, we made that change to Selesnya to make it a tokens deck, and immediately a Naya, like, go-wide deck, immediately 3-0'd.
Yep, we broke the cube. Come draft it with us. You can check out our socials. Find us on Twitter at JankDiverGaming, YouTube at youtube.com/JankDiverGaming. You can find Teld streaming our cubes whenever he's participating at twitch.tv/Teld Talks, TELD Talks. Teld, I did want to ask, do you stream other stuff besides our cubes?
I've streamed occasionally when I'm just doing retail drafts, but haven't really streamed anything else. I'm not opposed to it, but most of my streaming is just to stream our cubes, so if anybody wanted to watch, they can see what we're about.
Yeah, it's a good way to get your feet wet and kind of see if our cube looks like something that you even want to play, because you do end up investing some wild cards into building your decks. So if you want to check it out without like risking any resources, that would be a good way to do it.
Yeah, come hang out with Teld, heckle him a little bit.
You can comment on all of my terrible misplays.
Give him a reason to stream more. That sounds fun. That's going to go ahead and do it. We will be discussing some future topics behind the camera, but that's it for Cantrips. Hope you all had a good one, and we will see you all next time.
Take care.
So, I promise I'm not always going to do a sign-off, but I have a sign-off. I wanted to ask you guys a question about a card.
Okay.
So, Twitter discourse. Always fun to engage with. There's a new card.
Fun.
There's a new card from Wilds of Eldraine. It is a common called Shatter the Oath. It is 3 black, sorcery. Destroy target creature or enchantment. Create a Wicked Roll token attached to target creature you control. I'm not reading the card, but I'm pretty sure that's almost word for word the text. Do you consider this a color pie break?
Because it can destroy an enchantment?
Yeah. So black has the ability to destroy enchantments. It targets enchantments now. That is not a new thing with this set. It was introduced in
Zendikar Rising
Commander deck, and then Zendikar Rising had Feed the Swarm.
Yeah, it was excellent.
Which was destroy an enchantment, but you lost life equal to the mana value of that enchantment. There was somebody of note who posted this card, said it's the worst design of all time, Shatter the Oath, because it is a black targeted enchantment destruction with no drawback. How do you feel? Do you agree with that
statement? The drawback is that it cost 1 million mana.
Yeah.
Okay, so he got a lot of backlash, and that was basically his. That was the response. Is this card does have a drawback? It is that it is a sorcery and that it's expensive. Does this card break the color pie?
No.
I don't think so. Like, it always struck me as a little weird that black had so few ways to interact with enchantments when ostensibly black is supposed to be able to do whatever it wants. The only other way that they seem to have conceptualized to do that is to have you, like, pay life. But I think I agree with the community that having it cost 5 goddamn mana is a pretty significant cost. Because, like, you're never going to see a card this expensive that destroys enchantments in green, right?
Yeah, even in the set, there's an adventure creature that costs 2 to destroy an enchantment or artifact, right? It's like, and granted, this card can kill creatures too, but like, it also needs to be said, this format's really, really fast. It's good. I really like it, but it is fast. It is a proactive format, so 5 mana for your Doomblade is just not where you want to be when there is a 2 mana instant that kills basically every creature in the format. In Candy Grapple, I think's the name of it.
The argument kind of went back and forth for a little bit. I thought it was interesting because I see where the person was coming from. If you just look at this card on face value, it looks like this is doing something that black shouldn't do, but I think the game developers have determined that this is something. If the game developers tell you that that's something black can do, then it's something black can do. It might not feel right. Like, I get the feel here. Doesn't it just feel wrong that this is a 5 mana sorcery that kills an enchantment? Like,
no.
It feels wrong in black to me.
I think if it costs 2 mana and destroyed an enchantment, I would say it feels wrong. But I think it makes a lot of sense for black to destroy enchantments anyways. I think it also allows them to be a little more broad about putting them into sets, because now you have, like, giving one color more access to enchantment removal doesn't sound like much, but when you think about how every 2 color pair works out, it means that your colors are just much more likely to be able to deal with it. Your average deck is much more likely to have access to that effect. And I think that allows you to be more flexible in the kind of cards you're designing in enchantments without them being completely busted and warping formats.
I mean, Feed the Swarm already does this for 2 mana. You just lose some life.
Well, so the thing that a lot of people clap back on was Feed the Swarm has a very obvious drawback that's written on the card, but the Shatter the Oath has like a hidden drawback of being expensive, which the original poster didn't recognize and didn't really catch on, because his response to the feedback was, "Are you ever cutting this card in a limited deck?" And I was like, yes.
Yeah,
frequently.
Like if this is the problem, is that I feel like some people aren't regularly playing limited, and like if you haven't played limited in like 5 years, sure, maybe a 5 mana Doomblade seems okay, but like that's just not where limited's at anymore. My 5 mana cards are winning the game, and I'm playing like 2 of them. Yeah,
and then the last thing that this kind of brought up is, in modern card design, is the word sorcery a drawback?
Has it ever not been?
What?
I don't know. That was part of the conversation here. Some people said sorcery is not inherently a drawback. It's just depends on the design of the card.
Sorcery is just inherently, like, any card that's a sorcery would just be strictly better as an instant, right? Like, even if you normally played it as a sorcery.
By definition. Look, this was a fun Twitter conversation. Is all I'm saying.
I mean, they in fact didn't they design? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I didn't play a lot of the set. But wasn't one of the Ravnica sets they made a bunch of instants and gave you bonuses for casting them as a sorcery, and most of the time you still just cast them as an instant?
Yeah, the addendum stuff, good mechanic, great stuff, almost as good as Undergrowth.
Hey, Undergrowth is a great mechanic with no good cards. I maintain that.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring that up because it was interesting conversation. I promise I won't have a sign off every single time, unless more Twitter Discord comes up. I do love sharing the Twitter discourse, but yeah, thanks for indulging me on that one.
We'll have to come up with like a theme song or something.
Yeah, just all three of us can do like just do some jazzy improv.
Unga Bunga Green.
Oonga Boonga.
I'm not sure that I know what Exodia does.